Welcome to Fresh Pulp Magazine's first book talk. I decided that for Black History Month, I am going to honor African American science fiction writers. And I decided to start with the person who started me down the road of science fiction and ultimately made me want to be one myself. So the first Fresh Pulp TikTok is going to be book talk, is Stephen Barnes' Street Lethal. And the reason why I chose this book is because because this book in particular was the book that made me want to be a science fiction writer, and it made me want to read more cyberpunk because it is a cyberpunk tale. But also because the main character is African American. However, as you can see, the character on the front of the cover is not African American, at least not obviously. This is the cover that I fell in love with as a kid in the 90s. And as you can see, the character portrayed on the cover is African American. A little bit of trivia, and I can't confirm this, but it's been said and heard that the reason why the first cover portrayed a guy who looked white-ish is because the publishers did not want to put an African American on a protagonist on the cover of a book in 1983 when the book was first published. That was since rectified in 1991, and that's the cover that I found when I was a kid in the bookstore and fell in love. I'm not going to go into a summary of the book. I'm simply going to point out some things that I felt like were particularly prophetic that Barnes put in the book. The first of which is the carceral system in the United States. In the beginning of the book, the main character, Aubrey Knight, is sent to prison, and part of his job as a former mob enforcer is to convince the inmates to offer up their organs in exchange for reduced prison sentences. And I think that hits very clearly upon the nature of the American carceral system, which is extractive, not punitive, and not rehabilitative. Another interesting aspect of this book is Aubrey Knight's girlfriend, Promise, who's a sex worker. And typically in stories of that time, sex workers were usually either victims or informants, or they were really small parts of the story. This character had a lot of agency, and she was actually very integral to the emotional development of Aubrey Knight, as well as the trajectory of the story. The book takes place in a future Los Angeles, which is destroyed. And Aubrey Knight hooks up with a bunch of people who live in the wreckage of old Los Angeles called scavengers. And even though they're viewed more or less as like hobos and homeless people, they actually have a very sophisticated form of governance and a method of barter. So they're like anarchists, and I felt like that was very cool. Finally, it should be noted that William Gibson's seminal work, Neuromancer, was published in 1984, a year after this book. And the two other most notable authors, Effinger and Williams, were published 3 and 4 years, respectively, after this work. I'm honoring Barnes today because he was one of the first cyberpunk authors out there. And this work is not only beautifully written, beautiful prose, but it's a great story.